Hello, hello, and welcome to this chapter on the skeletal system or skeletal system. And specifically, this chapter focuses on bone tissue. We have split it into two lessons. The first lesson looks at the functions of bone tissue and the skeletal system, as well as the histology and a little bit of gross anatomy of the skeletal system. So we will be considering the functions of bone and bone tissue in that they provide support, protection, they assist in movement. We saw that when we looked at our 11 organ systems. They also act as a reservoir for minerals to be stored. Bone tissue is also the site of blood cell production. Bet you didn't know that. We're going to talk about that process. And bone is also a site of triglyceride storage. On this slide, we have two of the obvious functions of bone and the skeletal system. Bone provides a structural framework for the body. The skeleton acts as attachment points and encasements for the soft tissues and the internal organs. With respect to skeletal muscle, the skeleton and the bones are the structures to which muscles attach via tendons. So tendons transmit the force generated by the muscles to the bones, pulling on the bones to generate movement at joints. So as you review the 11 organ systems, hopefully you made that connection that the skeletal muscles and bones work together at joints to create movement. Number two, the skeletal system provides protection. So we talked about encasement, that the bones protect the internal organs and help to form the cavities in which these organs are housed. For example, the cranium, which is made up of 8 bones, surrounds and protects your very delicate, very important brain. And equally important is your spinal cord, which is surrounded by the vertebral canal formed by a passageway made through the stacked vertebrae of your spine. The ribs, the sternum, and the vertebrae form the thoracic cage that protects the lungs, the heart, and the organs of the mediastinum. Hope you're familiar with that word from the first week. And the pelvis partially protects the reproductive and urinary organs in the pelvic region. So protection is very important. I should also mention that the rib cage partially protects the more superior abdominal organs as well. If you look at the anatomy of the thorax, you'll note that the ribs flare inferiorly in the back and provide some protection for the abdominal organs such as the kidneys, the liver, and the stomach. We partially described this third function, assistance in movement, on the previous slide, where again, skeletal muscles attached to bone via tendons, and the force of contraction, which shortens the muscles, is transmitted via tendons to the bone. So tendons are dense, regular connective tissue, you will recall, that attach muscles to bones. And in so doing, they transmit the force from the muscles to the bones to pull on them, creating movement. And this is something you'll hear me repeat, so I might as well tell you now. Muscles create movement by pulling on bones. They never push. But we'll get into that more when we get into the muscular system. Fourth function, which is less obvious. Bone tissue participates in mineral homeostasis. As you know, the matrix of bone tissue or osseous tissue is mineralized, and that creates a very dense matrix and tissue. The bone tissue is hard, which allows it to perform the function of support and movement and protection, but the minerals are there for storage. So they act as a reservoir for critical minerals, particularly calcium, phosphorus, and others. Meaning what? Whenever your blood levels of calcium are out of homeostatic range, calcium and phosphorus will be deposited into the bone or removed from the bone and returned to the blood to maintain blood homeostatic levels of these minerals. So, we will see this later on. Your body is more concerned with maintaining blood, calcium, and other mineral homeostasis more than bone density homeostasis. In that, if your blood levels of these minerals drop too low, there will be hormones released that will stimulate the breakdown of the bone to release these stored minerals into the blood to maintain blood levels at the expense of maintaining bone density. We will revisit that later on, but keep that in mind. A fifth function of bone tissue, again less obvious, is blood cell production. Did you know that your blood cells were produced by a loose connective tissue in your bone cavities? This process is called hemopoiesis or hematopoiesis. Those are synonyms. And this process occurs from pluripotent stem cells in red bone marrow. So red bone marrow fills the cavities of bones in children, all cavities, so the spaces in the spongy bones and the spaces in the large medullary cavity of long bones. That is all red bone marrow that produces blood cells. As we age, most of that red marrow is converted into yellow marrow, which is made up of triglycerides. But red marrow persists in some areas of the body. So I suggest you look this up, but I'll give you a quick list now. In the adult skeleton, red marrow or hematopoietic bone marrow is still present or persists. In the head of the femur, the head of the humerus, or the proximal epiphyses of those bones, as well as in the sternum, in the vertebrae, in the coccyx or pelvic bones, as well as the flat bones of the skull. Depending on which textbook you read, you might also read that red bone marrow is still present in the ribs as well. Okay, but definitely the flat bones of the skull, so the frontal bone, the parietal bones, the sternum, the hips, the vertebrae, and the proximal ends of the humerus and femur bones. All other cavities and all other bones contain yellow marrow in the adult. Now, while red bone marrow produces blood cells, please note that all colored blood cells are produced by red bone marrow. So red blood cells, white blood cells, and cell fragments called platelets or thrombocytes are also produced in the red bone marrow. And our sixth function of bone and skeletal system is triglyceride storage. So I mentioned that in the adult, most of the cavity spaces are filled with yellow marrow. That is adipose tissue, where adipocytes or adipose cells store large amounts of triglycerides. So in this way, the yellow marrow acts as a potential energy reserve as those triglycerides can be released and broken down to provide substrates for ATP synthesis. We will now spend a little time on this slide looking at the general structure of a long bone. So in this diagram, we have a frontal section through the humerus bone, and it shows you the two major regions of a long bone. So bones have different shapes. First, we're considering the anatomy of a long bone, such as the humerus, or the femur, or the tibia, or the ulna. We'll mention some long bones later. All right, the long, intermediate, hollow part of a long bone is called the diaphysis, also known as the shaft. And the hollow region in the diaphysis is called the medullary cavity, or the medullary cavity, and that houses bone marrow. Please note that the wall of the diaphysis is made up of one of the two types of bone tissue. This is dense or compact bone. So that's the heavier bone type, arranged in repeating units called osteons. We will look at that later. Extending on either end from the diaphysis are the epiphyses. One is an epiphysis. So the epiphyses are the enlarged, rounded, in general, ends of the bones. We have a proximal epiphysis and a distal epiphysis for each long bone. Covering the epiphyses are layers of articular or hyaline cartilage. All right. Now the epiphyses are made up predominantly of spongy bone. And spongy bone is made up of repeating units called trabeculae. Between the trabeculae, you have spaces or little cavities that house bone marrow. So in the epiphyses, bone marrow is found in the spaces between the trabeculae. In the diaphysis, bone marrow is found in the medullary cavity. The metaphysis is the intermediate region connecting the epiphysis to the diaphysis. Metaphysis is also significant because during infancy and childhood, there is a band of cartilage that runs through the metaphysis called the epiphyseal growth plate. As we age and become adults, that cartilage plate is converted into bone tissue. And on the diagram here, you can see it's labeled the epiphyseal line. So once the cartilage is ossified or is converted into bone tissue, we can no longer grow in length or height. Okay, so that occurs around age 18 to 21. Articular cartilage, we mentioned, covers the epiphyses, and the epiphyses is also the region where the bones articulate with each other or meet at a joint. So this is joint cartilage or articular cartilage. This cartilage protects the bone ends against friction, wear and tear. It also provides shock absorption and protects the epiphyses. Now you'll recall that articular cartilage and cartilage in general is avascular. So this cartilage is nourished by diffusion of oxygen and nutrients from blood vessels in the underlying bone. And later when we get to the chapter on joints, we'll see that the synovial fluid that fills the joint cavities also nourishes this cartilage. The periosteum is the layer of dense, irregular connective tissue that covers the diaphysis. So you can say that the superficial layer of the diaphysis is the periosteum. The periosteum is significant because it contains blood vessels and nerves that extend into the compact bone of the diaphysis, providing nourishment, waste removal, as well as innervation. So your bone is very sensitive. It has a lot of nerve endings, and these provide signals into the central nervous system regarding bone and joint activity. The periosteum also acts as the attachment point for tendons from muscles and ligaments which attach bone to bone. Okay, that's the periosteum. Periosteum is also the attachment point for the fibrous layer of the joint capsule. Again, we'll see that later when we get to the chapter on articulations. The medullary cavity is the hollow center of the diaphysis. It houses bone marrow. It is lined with a thin layer of tissue called the endosteum. And both the endosteum internally, endo meaning inner, and periosteum meaning around, see the etymology there, contain bone cells for the development or the remodeling of the bone tissue. We'll explore that later. All right, so that's the anatomy of a long bone, be able to identify each of the structures, also be able to identify their functions. All right, let's look at the histology of bone tissue. Bone tissue is a unique connective tissue in that the matrix is hard. The matrix surrounds widely separated cells in little cavities called lacunae. You'll see that on a future slide. But let's talk about the extracellular matrix because that's really where the nature of bone tissue exists. The extracellular matrix is made up of 25% water, even though the bone is hard, and 25% collagen fibers. These collagen fibers provide flexibility for bone, which sounds odd because when you think of bone, you think of rigid structures that you can use to play drums, right? They provide the framework for your body. You think of the skeleton as being hard and rigid, but bone is actually quite flexible. And if it wasn't flexible, when muscle pulled on it, those forces would cause bones to break. Okay? So while bone is hard, it is also flexible due to the collagen fibers. The collagen fibers also create a meshwork or a framework within the bone tissue for the deposition of the crystallized minerals. So the extracellular matrix contains deposits of calcium phosphate as well as another mineral salt called calcium hydroxide, and they form crystals called hydroxyapatite, and these are deposited on the collagen fibers and create the extracellular matrix. And as they are deposited, they harden, and that's what makes bone hard. This calcification process is initiated by bone-building cells called osteoblasts. The osteoblasts lay down the extracellular matrix and create bone. So again, while bone is hard and rigid due to the crystallization of these minerals, bone is also flexible due to the collagen fiber. So there are 4 major types of cells present in bone tissue. The less differentiated cells are the osteogenic cells. Being less specialized, these undergo regular cell division or proliferation in the process of bone development, growth, and remodeling. As these cells divide, they also differentiate into osteoblasts. So osteoblasts are slightly more specialized cells that lay down the extracellular matrix, as we saw in the previous slide, and therefore are responsible for building new bone tissue. That's another thing about bone. As rigid and solid and immovable as they seem, bone is very dynamic. Bone tissue is constantly being built up and broken down in response to several factors, including the stress placed on bones, so how much the bones are used or pulled on, or how much they have to respond to gravity, as well as mineral homeostasis. So earlier we described that bone will be broken down in order to release stored minerals into the blood as necessary, or if those minerals are in excess, they will be deposited into the bone for storage. So bone tissue is constantly undergoing changes. So much so, friends, that the bulk of your femur that you have today is not the femur you had 6 months ago. That's actually new bone tissue, believe it or not. I speak very generally there. All right, now, as osteoblasts lay down extracellular matrix and it becomes hard around them, they further differentiate into osteocytes. And these now are the mature bone cells that maintain the matrix by exchanging nutrients and wastes with the blood, and the osteocytes reside in little cavities called lacunae because of the hardness of the matrix. Now, a 4th bone cell is unrelated to the other 3. So osteogenic cells become osteoblasts that become osteocytes. Osteoclasts, the 4th type of bone tissue cell, are actually specialized macrophages. These are cells that phagocytize and break down pre-existing bone tissue. So these release enzymes that digest the mineral components of the bone matrix. It's a process called resorption, and in doing so, they release the stored calcium into the blood. There is a hormone that stimulates the activity of the osteoclasts, It's called parathyroid hormone, and we will look at the regulation of that hormone later on in this unit. So again, we have four bone tissue cells. Osteogenic cells are the progenitor cells that give rise to the osteoblasts. The osteoblasts lay down new bone matrix and build bone. The blasts build the bone, while the osteocytes are the mature bone cells that maintain the matrix, maintain the bone tissue, and reside in lacunae, while the osteoclasts resorb and break down bone. Here's a diagram showing you the four bone cells. Again, osteogenic cells become osteoblasts, and the osteoblasts become osteocytes. We also have the osteoclasts, which are unrelated to the other three, and these perform bone breakdown. So a question to ask yourself is, which of these cells, through their activity, will increase blood calcium levels, and which of these cells, through their activity, will lower blood calcium levels? We'll talk about it later, but keep that question at the forefront of your mind for now. So bone tissue comes in two types. There is compact bone and spongy bone. Compact bone is dense. It is the strongest form of bone. It provides protection and support because it is dense, and it is formed by repeating units called osteons, which I will describe on the next slide. Recall that compact bone is found in the wall of the diaphyses of your long bones. You also have compact bone forming the two outer or superficial layers of flat bones, like a sandwich, the bread of a sandwich. And we also have a thin layer of compact bone in the epiphyses of your long bones. The other bone tissue type is spongy bone. It is spongy because it has a lot of cavities. We have layers of bone tissue, but they are arranged in little tufts or columns that form an irregular lattice, and those lattices are called trabeculae. So again, osteons are repeating units of bone found in compact bone, while trabeculae are irregular tufts or columns of bone in spongy bone. Spongy bone, as you saw, makes up the bulk of the epiphyses of your long bones, and also forms the middle layer of flat bones, or the meat, or the cheese, or Brussels sprouts of your sandwich, the peanut butter, if you will. Compact bone, because of the arrangement of tissues, is able to resist stresses produced by weight and movement. So this bone will not break under stress. And that's why it provides protection and support. Compact bone is formed by arrangements of repeating units called osteons, also known as Haversian systems. Each osteon consists of several layers or lamellae of bone tissue arranged circularly or concentrically, like sheets of paper towel around a roll. Okay? And the roll in the paper towel is a passageway. Within the osteon, it would be called the central or Haversian canal. So again, layers of bone tissue surrounding a central passageway. Now within the layers of bone tissue, we have little cavities called lacunae that house the mature blood cells. You know these are the osteocytes. And because the bone matrix is hard, blood cannot travel directly to the osteocytes within the lacunae. Therefore, fluids, nutrients, gases, wastes are exchanged via tiny passageways called canaliculi, or one is a canaliculus, that connect blood vessels in passageways to the osteocytes within the lacunae. It will make more sense when you see the diagram. Again, here's the osteon, which has central canals that run longitudinally through the bone tissue, like the tubes in a paper towel roll. And then the layers of concentric bone tissue are lamellae that are like the sheets of paper towel around the roll. Okay? Or here they compare them to the rings of a tree trunk. And again, we have our lacunae, the spaces or cavities that house the osteocytes. And extending, radiating from the lacunae in all directions are the tiny passageways called canaliculi that connect the osteocytes with the blood vessels in larger cavities. One more slide on osteons. So again, the canaliculi are the tiny passageways that form a system of interconnected canals and provide routes for nutrients and gases and waste to be exchanged between the osteocytes and the blood in the blood vessels running through larger passageways. Now, we mentioned that bone is very dynamic, so it's always being changed in response to stressors and mineral requirements. So the organization of the osteons change. Osteons are formed and developed in areas of increased stress, and they are broken down in areas of decreased stress. This is an important feature of bone tissue. If you don't use it, you lose it. Bone breaks down whenever it's not stressed. We will revisit that concept. All right, finally, we have a diagram to which we can relate and hopefully visualize some of these descriptives that we've provided. So on the right side, you see a single osteon that looks like a column or a tree trunk or a paper towel roll with the concentric layers or lamellae of bone tissue. And the tiny dark spots you see, those are lacunae, and each one of them houses a single osteocyte. So you can see that on the magnified diagram to the far right of the page. Radiating from each lacuna are the tiny passageways, the canaliculi, that look like the tiny lines in the main diagram. And then several osteons are packaged together, and the spaces between them are filled with interstitial lamellae. And then surrounding the entire width of the bone and wrapping all the osteons together, we have circumferential lamellae. All right, running through the center of each osteon is your central canal that contains the blood vessels that bring oxygen and nutrients to each osteon. And then these connect via the canaliculi to the osteocytes and the lacunae. So we have exchange of gases, wastes, nutrients, and fluids via the canaliculi with the blood vessels that run through the central canals. And note that the blood vessels in the central canals reach each osteon via horizontally aligned canals called perforating canals. And these blood vessels originate outside of the bone through the periosteum. All right, as you go to the left of the diagram, you'll see a thin layer of spongy bone in the medullary cavity, extending into the medullary cavity, and there the lamellae are arranged in irregular columns called trabeculae. So let's talk about spongy bone. Spongy bone does not have osteons. Again, the layers of bone tissue or lamellae are arranged in a lattice that make up trabeculae. And the spaces now between the trabeculae lighten the bone. If bone was all compact bone, and if the diaphysis did not have a medullary cavity, then bone would be very heavy and it would be nearly impossible for your muscles to create movement by pulling on the bones. You would be too heavy. So the medullary cavity in the diaphysis, as well as the spaces in the spongy bone, help to lighten the bone and lighten your skeleton so that you are actually mobile. Now, the trabeculae support and protect the marrow found in the cavities. If it's red marrow, it's hematopoietic, it produces blood cells. And of course, associated with the red marrow are many blood vessels that take those newly formed cells into the general circulation. Now, the lamellae still have lacunae that contain your osteocytes and the canaliculi that connect with the blood vessels running through the cavities of the spongy bone. So the interior bone tissue, we saw it lining The medullary cavity, as well as the epiphyses, is made up primarily of spongy bone, as well as a central layer of bone tissue and flat bones. So, while trabeculae and spongy bone are light and more fragile, the bone tissue is still laid down along the lines of stress to minimize breakage. All right, we mentioned that bone tissue, as boring and rigid as it looks, is actually very dynamic and is vascularized. It has a blood supply. It also is innervated. It has a nerve supply. And the blood supply originates from the periosteal arteries that run, of course, through the periosteum. And innervation comes by nerves that also penetrate the periosteum and then into the compact and up into the spongy bone. We also have veins that carry blood away from the long bones. The nerve supply to the bones are sensitive to stress on the bones as well as tearing and tension. So they inform your brain about the activity of your bones, which is also important to let your brain rather know about the position of your bones in space and movement for posture and balance and mobility. That innervation is very important. And of course, if someone breaks their bone, they will feel pain. Let's move on to describe how bone tissue is formed. The process by which bone is formed is called ossification or osteogenesis. Throughout life, bone formation occurs in 4 situations. Initially, we need the development of the bony skeleton during embryonic development, so that's in uterus. Then, we need continued bone growth and development throughout infancy, childhood, and adolescence until adulthood when we stop growing. Thirdly, throughout life, remodeling of bone occurs where old bone is broken down and replaced by new bone. Particularly, we have breakdown of old bone in areas of decreased stress or to replace blood mineral levels from bone reserves, while bone buildup occurs in areas of increased bone stress where increased bone density is needed. And lastly, ossification is required for the repair of fractured bones. Ossification, again, that is the formation of bone tissue, actually begins during embryonic development at about 6 weeks gestation. Bone tissue develops from mesenchyme, which is one of the 3 embryonic tissues. So mesenchyme gives rise to all the connective tissues, including bone tissue, along with all the muscular tissues. Bone formation from mesenchyme follows one of 2 patterns, either intramembranous ossification or endochondral ossification. Intramembranous ossification is responsible for the development of a few bones in the body, including the flat bones of the skull, along with the mandible, part of the clavicle, and a few other bones. Endochondral ossification is the more common way bones are formed, particularly the long bones of the body. Let me give you a quick summary of each pattern of ossification. Intramembranous ossification occurs when mesenchymal cells are stimulated to differentiate into osteogenic cells, which then mature into osteoblasts. The osteoblasts secrete the organic extracellular matrix of osseous tissue and become surrounded by it, developing into the more mature osteocytes residing in lacunae. Following secretion of the osseous extracellular matrix, there is deposition of calcium and other minerals into the matrix, a process called calcification. This makes the matrix hard and rigid. Trabeculae then form within the bone tissue, and blood vessels develop in the spaces between the trabeculae. You will hopefully recall that trabeculae make up spongy bone. Finally, a thin layer of compact bone develops superficially around the core of spongy bone, and surrounding the compact bone, the remaining mesenchyme differentiates into the periosteum that surrounds the bone. So again, if you think of flat bone as a sandwich of spongy bone between two layers of compact bone, you can get an idea of how these bones come to be through intramembranous ossification. Now within the skull, the bones do not fit together perfectly, and there are spaces between the bones called fontanelles or soft spots. These spaces allow the flat bones to actually slide over each other to decrease the infant's head size to ease passage of the fetus through the birth canal during delivery. These spaces then become ossified after birth to complete formation of the skull. We will discuss endochondral ossification on the next slide. All right, on this slide, we just have a step-by-step overview of the process of endochondral ossification. You can see that after the mesenchymal layer is converted into a cartilage model, you can actually see the beginnings of the epiphyses and the diaphysis. The cartilage becomes calcified and begins to break down. Nutrient arteries enter the area, creating ossification centers. Most of that cartilage is then replaced with osseous tissue with the activity of the osteoblasts. Then more arteries infiltrate the ends of the model into the future epiphyses, forming secondary ossification centers. Please note that there's a band of cartilage that remains, and this cartilage forms the articular cartilage that covers the epiphyseal ends, as well as the epiphyseal plate that runs through the metaphysis. And this epiphyseal plate of cartilage is important for long bone growth, as we'll see in future slides. So the diaphysis is converted mainly into compact bone, while the epiphyses develop spongy bone. All right, so how do bones grow? Long bones grow in length or longitudinally by endochondral ossification. Bones grow in length due to first, growth of the cartilage in the epiphyseal plate and articular cartilage, which is then replaced by osseous tissue. Chondrocytes in the cartilage nearer to the epiphyses proliferate and extend the length of the bone towards the ends. Meanwhile, calcification of the older cartilage is followed by ossification as osteoblasts and blood vessels invade the deeper cartilage from the diaphysis. So, as the cartilage grows, the bone lengthens, and then the cartilage is replaced by bone tissue. So here's another summary of bone growth during infancy, childhood, and adolescence. So the cartilage that remains in long bones, forming the articular cartilage and the epiphyseal line, contain chondrocytes that proliferate and essentially extend the bone by extending the cartilage. But that cartilage becomes calcified, and then osteoblasts invade the area and lay down bony matrix, replacing the cartilage with bone tissue. So this is very similar to what we saw with endochondral ossification during fetal or embryonic and fetal development. Now this continues throughout childhood and adolescence, and as an individual approaches adulthood, they stop growing in height because the cartilage of the epiphyseal plate is replaced by bone tissue. So it becomes ossified and is now called the epiphyseal line. You may hear the expression that the epiphyseal plate closes. So the chondrocytes are replaced by bony tissue. It was the proliferation of the chondrocytes that caused the bone to grow. And when the chondrocytes are no longer there and have been replaced by osteocytes, that now ends growth in height, and we reach our adult height. While bones are growing in length, they're also being remodeled to get the correct length and shape of both the diaphysis and the epiphysis. So let's talk about remodeling. Bones not only grow in length, but they also grow in width in a process called appositional growth. If your bones did not grow in width as they grew in length, you essentially would have human-sized toothpicks for your skeleton. During appositional growth, osteoblasts on the inner surface of the periosteum lay down new bone tissue. This increases the size of the bone from the outer surface. Concurrently, osteoclasts in the endosteum, which lines the medullary cavity, eat away or resorb old bone from the inner surface, widening the cavity. In this way, the bone increases in diameter while the thickness of the diaphysis wall is maintained and the bone does not become too heavy. As stated earlier, remodeling of bone occurs throughout life, from embryonic development and during infancy, childhood, and adolescence, throughout adulthood, and until death. There's an ongoing replacement of old bone tissue with new bone tissue, again, mainly in response to stressors on the bone, as well as blood mineral requirements. Osteoblasts build new bone in areas of increased stress, for example, where tendons attach to and pull on bone, especially in response to increased physical activity or even weight gain. Osteoblasts break down or resorb old bone in areas of decreased stress, for example, if one becomes sedentary or immobile. We will also consider the activity of these cells in response to blood calcium levels. Now, I mentioned in an earlier slide that the femur you have today is not the one you had a few months ago. Fun fact, the distal portion of each femur is replaced on average every 4 months. Normal bone metabolism, that is the buildup and breakdown of bone tissue, depends on several factors, which we will summarize here. Number one, minerals. Bone tissue is unique in that the extracellular matrix is highly mineralized. Large amounts of calcium and phosphorus, in addition to smaller amounts of magnesium, fluoride, and manganese, are required for bone growth and remodeling. Now, maybe some of you saw fluoride and thought, teeth! Yes, you need fluoride for strong teeth also, but please note that teeth are organs of the digestive system, not the skeletal system. All right, normal bone metabolism also requires adequate amounts of several vitamins. Vitamin A, in addition to being necessary for good eye health and vision, is also required to stimulate the activity of osteoblasts. So vitamin A is important for building new bone. Vitamin C is very important for bone health. Vitamin C is needed for the synthesis of collagen. You may have heard of a disease called scurvy. It was very common among sailors and pirates where they would become weak, and it was characterized by their teeth falling out. And they realized that the connective tissue in the gums that held the teeth in the jaws was breaking down because of decreased vitamin C and decreased collagen synthesis. So again, you need vitamin C for synthesis of collagen throughout the body in all of your connective tissues, but also in the bone. And recall that collagen is required for bone flexibility and also provides the framework for the deposition of the minerals we mentioned above. All right, moving on to vitamin D. Vitamin D helps build bone by increasing the absorption of calcium from the food we ingest in the gastrointestinal tract. And when we get to the integumentary system, we will see how vitamin D is processed in your body, but you definitely need vitamin D for calcium absorption. Otherwise, the calcium in the food you ingest will pass through the digestive tract unabsorbed. Finally, vitamins K and B have other purposes in the body, but in the skeletal system, they are needed for the synthesis of bone proteins. Proper bone homeostasis also requires hormones. Now, during infancy and childhood, the hormones that are most important to bone growth are called insulin-like growth factors, IGFs, and these are produced mainly by the liver in response to the hormone, human growth hormone, from the anterior pituitary. So human growth hormone exerts its effects mainly through insulin-like growth factor with respect to growth, particularly in the skeletal and muscular system, where here The IGF stimulate osteoblasts and promote cell division at the epiphyseal plate. So that would be the proliferation of the chondrocytes that allow for longitudinal growth. And insulin-like growth factors also enhance protein synthesis in bone tissue as well as muscle tissue. So, as the name suggests, these factors promote growth by stimulating the growth of bone and muscle. Thyroid hormones also are important during childhood development as they promote bone growth by stimulating osteoblasts as well. And insulin promotes bone growth by increasing the synthesis of bone proteins. Insulin is an anabolic hormone that promotes, among other things, protein synthesis. So remember, bone is not just minerals, it's not just calcium. Bone is 25% proteins. Other hormones begin to exert their effects at the beginning of puberty. So as one enters adolescence, the sex hormones, estrogens and androgens, testosterone being the main one, cause dramatic effects on bone growth and are responsible for the sudden growth spurt that occurs during the teenage years. In females, estrogens promote changes in the skeleton, such as widening of the pelvis. In males, we see the effects of testosterone as it causes broadening of the shoulders and chiseling of those facial features. Now, interesting fact, the adrenal glands of both males and females produce androgens, and some tissues like adipose tissue can convert androgens into estrogens. This means that females produce both female and male sex hormones, estrogens more, and a little bit of androgens. Conversely, males produce a lot of testosterone, mainly from the testicles, but men also have circulating levels of estrogens. Hope that didn't blow your mind. Now, the estrogen in males and females is responsible for the closing of the epiphyseal plate. Because females produce more estrogens, mainly from their ovaries, the epiphyseal plates close earlier in females and they stop growing at an earlier age. Around 17, that's when females reach their adult height. While in males who produce less estrogens, their epiphyseal plates close later in life and males reach their adult height, stop growing at around age 19, 20, 21. Post-adolescence in adulthood, estrogens and androgens contribute to bone remodeling, mainly by slowing the resorption of old bone. So they work to maintain bone. This effect is more obvious in the older female, as the rate of bone breakdown outpaces that of bone buildup once estrogen levels fall significantly after menopause. The older female has a significantly higher risk of developing porous, low-density, fragile bones in a condition called osteoporosis, and we will discuss that later. Other hormones, such as parathyroid hormone, calcitriol, which is the active form of vitamin D, and calcitonin, these hormones affect bone remodeling as well, but mainly their role is to regulate blood calcium levels. Let's look at that in the next few slides. One of the less obvious roles of bone tissue is that of calcium reservoir. The levels of calcium in the blood are actually maintained by balancing or altering the rates of calcium resorption from old bone and releasing that calcium into the blood versus the rates of calcium deposition from the blood into new bone. Now, blood calcium levels have to be maintained in a homeostatic range because both nerve and muscle function depend on calcium ions. And we're talking about the nerves that allow you to control your activities consciously, as well as your subconscious autonomic functions, your involuntary visceral functions. You also need proper muscle function just to breathe. So if calcium levels are out of normal range, it can lead to death. Calcium is also required for blood clotting And excessive blood loss and hypovolemia can also lead to death. And many enzymes require calcium as a cofactor. So hopefully you get the idea that normal calcium homeostasis is required for life. The main hormone regulating blood calcium levels is parathyroid hormone, or PTH. PTH is secreted from the parathyroid glands, which are located on the posterior aspect of the thyroid gland, which is located in the cervical region of the body, anterior to the trachea. Parathyroid hormone is released in response to low blood calcium levels. The effect of parathyroid hormone is going to be to raise blood calcium levels in a classic negative feedback pathway, and it does so in three ways. The main target of parathyroid hormone is bone tissue, where parathyroid hormone increases the number and activity of osteoclasts. In doing so, the osteoclasts will break down or resorb old bone. This will release the stored calcium from the bone into the blood, thereby raising blood calcium levels back into homeostatic range. Rising blood calcium levels feed back to shut down parathyroid hormone release. The second target of parathyroid hormone are the kidneys, where parathyroid hormone promotes the reabsorption of calcium from the urine filtrate back into the blood so that less calcium is lost in the urine and it is retained in the body. This also helps to raise and maintain blood calcium levels. Finally, parathyroid hormone targets the kidneys where it activates vitamin D into calcitriol or calcitriol. This active form of vitamin D then targets the gastrointestinal tract to promote the absorption of calcium from the foods that we ingest. So parathyroid hormone, PTH, promotes resorption of bone, reabsorption of calcium in the kidneys, and absorption of calcium in the gastrointestinal tract. Here we have a beautiful depiction of the negative feedback pathway that regulates blood calcium levels through parathyroid hormone. So in this example, some stimulus disrupts homeostasis by decreasing blood calcium levels. For example, the individual is not ingesting enough calcium in their diet, or the client is not taking enough vitamin D and can't absorb calcium. Whatever the disruption is, blood calcium levels begin to decline. This will be detected by receptors in the parathyroid glands, and in response to the low calcium, these glands will release increased amounts of parathyroid hormone. So the parathyroid hormone gene is turned on in a signaling pathway. The body increases the amount of parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone then targets these effectors: osteoblasts in the bone, where their activity and number will be increased. This leads to increased bone resorption and release of stored calcium into the blood. Parathyroid hormone also targets the kidneys, leading to increased calcium reabsorption and activation of vitamin D into calcitriol. That increases calcium absorption from the gastrointestinal tract. Taken all together, these three effects increase blood levels of calcium. And as blood calcium levels rise back into homeostatic range, this feeds back, that's what's detected by that broken gray line, to shut down the release of parathyroid hormone. Now, when blood calcium levels are too high, for whatever reason, two things happen. We saw that rising blood calcium levels shuts down parathyroid hormone, but in children in particular, the thyroid gland will secrete the hormone calcitonin. So thyroid gland secretes not only thyroid hormone, but it also secretes the hormone calcitonin. And calcitonin also targets bone tissue, but here it inhibits osteoclast activity. The decreased osteoclast activity will result in decreased bone resorption, and now there's a switch in the balance between osteoblast and osteoclast activity. Now that there's decreased osteoclast activity, calcitonin indirectly promotes the uptake of calcium out of the blood and deposition into the bone by osteoblasts. So now because osteoblast activity outpaces osteoclast activity, there's an increase in bone building, which requires the uptake of calcium out of the blood into the bone. This essentially lowers blood calcium levels. In the adult, calcitonin is not so active and important. The levels of blood calcium are regulated primarily by increased or decreased levels of parathyroid hormone. We have mentioned several times that bone remodeling occurs in response to changes in physical stressors or mechanical stress on the bone. So exercise and physical activity or inactivity do affect bone strength and density. Under stress, bone tissue becomes stronger through deposition of mineral salts and production of collagen fibers as regulated by osteoblast activity, while unstressed bone diminishes in thickness and density because of the loss of bone minerals and decreased number of collagen fibers. So with bone tissue, if you don't use it, you lose it. The main mechanical stressors are due to the effects again of skeletal muscles pulling on bones via tendons, as well as the pull of gravity. You may have seen that in a infomercial or movie somewhere where astronauts come back after days and weeks in space and they are actually lighter because of decreased bone density. When they're out in space, the pull of gravity is decreased and that decreases the stressor on their bones. Weight-bearing activities such as walking and lifting weights, resistance training, all of those help to build and retain bone mass. Very important as you get older, especially in females, because as I mentioned, coming up, there's going to be a precipitous drop in estrogen levels, and that will then lead to increased osteoclast activity versus osteoblast, and you begin to lose bone density. So one way to counteract that is to build up extra bone density now while you can. We mentioned that sex hormones play an important role in maintaining bone tissue in the adult. As we age, the level of sex hormones begin to diminish in both males and females, and the drop is more pronounced in females after menopause. So what is menopause? It's when the ovaries stop cycling, stop uh, maturing oocytes, and decrease the production of estrogen. It shouldn't really be called menopause. It should be menostop because it's not coming back. Anyways, in response to the decreased levels of the sex hormones, both the androgens and the estrogens, bone mass decreases. And then osteoclast activity outpaces osteoblast activity. Bone resorption is greater than bone deposition. And this is more pronounced in the females. In addition to the drop in estrogen, females generally have smaller and less dense skeletons. So they are already at a disadvantage in that regard. So there are two principal effects of aging on bone tissue. Number one, loss of bone mass. And this results from the loss of calcium from the bone matrix, which is one of the symptoms characteristic of osteoporosis. So with osteoporosis, the again activity osteoclasts is greater than that of osteoblasts, and the bone tissue becomes porous and fragile and decalcified. Also, in the older adult, bones become brittle, and this results from a decreased rate of protein synthesis. Remember that collagen proteins give bone its tensile strength and flexibility. The loss of this flexibility leads to brittleness and increased susceptibility to fractures in bones that are already weak because of the decreased calcium. Taken together, these conditions contribute to osteoporosis. As you can see, healthy bone tissue in slide A compared to the porous, um, holy, for lack of a better word, osteoporotic bone on the right. So what can you do to minimize the development of osteoporosis? Maintain good calcium and vitamin D intake, and most importantly, stress those bones. Physical activity into the older advanced years is the best way to slow or prevent osteoporosis. And that's the end of this chapter. Hope you enjoyed that.